The Ghost of the Chinese Camp, Colombia's Forgotten Dead. Story narrated by F.J. George. After what happened at the Fallon House, I told myself I was done with Colombia. Catherine's cold fingers on my face, those empty eyes, I had my story. I could move on to another town, another ghost. But 3 nights ago, I had a dream. I was standing in darkness, surrounded by the sound of water. Not the gentle flow of a stream, but the roar of water under pressure, tearing through earth and stone. And in that water, I saw faces. Dozens of them. Hundreds. All Chinese men, all drowning, all reaching for me with desperate hands. I woke up at 3 a.m. with a name in my head, Wong Wei. I'd never heard that name before. But I knew, the way you sometimes just know things in dreams, that he was calling me back to Colombia. And this time, the story would be darker than anything I'd found in the Fallon House. Because this time, it wasn't just one ghost. It was an entire community that history tried to erase. Let me tell you what they don't put on the tourist plaques in Colombia. In 1850, when gold was discovered, Chinese miners flooded into California. They called it Gold Mountain, a place where a man could make his fortune and return home wealthy. By 1852, there were over 2,000 Chinese miners in Colombia alone, nearly a quarter of the population. They worked the claims that white miners had abandoned as played out. Using patient, meticulous techniques, they extracted gold from places everyone else had given up on. They built their own community on the outskirts of town, what they called Huaying, which means China Camp. But success breeds hatred. In 1852, California passed the foreign miners' tax, targeting Chinese workers specifically. $20 a month, more than most made. Those who couldn't pay were driven from their claims. Sometimes peacefully. Usually not. Then came the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But by then, the real damage was already done. Between 1850 and 1870, hundreds of Chinese miners disappeared around Colombia. The official records say they returned to China or moved to other camps. But the truth is simpler and more horrifying. They were murdered. Their bodies were dumped in mine shafts, thrown into the Stanislaus River, or buried in unmarked graves where the hydraulic mining operations would wash away any evidence. Wong Wei was one of them. And he wanted me to know his story. I arrived in Colombia just after dawn. This time I didn't go to the main historic district. Instead, I drove south, following a barely maintained dirt road into the foothills. China Camp isn't on any official maps. The state park doesn't maintain it. Most tourists don't even know it exists. But if you know where to look, if you follow the old hydraulic mining scars in the hillside, you can find what's left. It's not much. Stone foundations where buildings once stood. A collapsed well. Scattered pottery shards and rusted metal, half buried in the dirt. And in the center of it all, beneath a twisted oak tree, there are graves. Maybe 20 of them, marked with wooden posts that have rotted down to stumps. No names. No dates. Just anonymous dead in anonymous dirt. I set up my equipment in the shade of that oak tree. It was August, temperature already pushing 90, but under that tree, the air was cold. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with weather and everything to do with wrongness. I opened my notebook to start documenting the site, and that's when I saw it. Someone had been digging. One of the graves, the one nearest the tree, had been disturbed. The earth was torn up, fresh soil mixed with old. And sitting on top of the disturbed earth was a small porcelain bowl, the kind used for rice. It was old, cracked, but someone had recently placed it there. Inside the bowl was a handful of joss sticks. Incense. They were still burning. I was alone. I'd made sure of that. The road in had been empty, no cars, no hikers. But someone, something, had lit that incense within the last few minutes. Hello? My voice sounded too loud in that empty place. Is someone here? The wind stopped. Completely. The trees went still. Even the insects went silent. And then I heard it. Singing. It was coming from somewhere beyond the graves, deeper in what used to be the camp. A man's voice, singing in Cantonese. I don't speak Cantonese, but I knew it was a song, rhythmic, melodic, but infinitely sad. A song of loss and longing. I grabbed my camera and followed the sound. Beyond the graves, the landscape opened into what had once been the main mining area. Hydraulic mining, using high-pressure water to blast away hillsides, had carved deep gullies into the earth. The scars were still visible 140 years later, raw and red like open wounds. The singing was coming from one of those gullies. I descended carefully, the ground crumbling under my feet. The gully was maybe 30 feet deep, its walls striped with different colored layers of sediment and stone. At the bottom, water still trickled, runoff from the hills that never quite dried up. And standing in that water was a man. He had his back to me. He wore traditional Chinese clothing, a dark blue tunic and loose pants, both soaked through. His hair was long, tied in a queue down his back. He was singing that same sad song, and he was washing something in the water. Gold pans. He was washing gold pans that weren't there. "Excuse me," I called down. "Are you?" He turned around. His face was wrong. Not deformed, not monstrous, just wrong. Like looking at someone through water, features shifting and blurring. Where his eyes should have been, there were just dark hollows. And his mouth kept moving, kept singing, but the sound wasn't coming from him anymore. It was coming from all around me. The walls of the gully. The earth itself. A chorus of voices, all singing that same mournful song. The man, the thing that looked like a man, raised one hand and pointed at the wall behind me. I turned, and the earth began to change. Images appeared in the striped sediment, like watching a film projected onto stone. I saw Chinese miners working this very spot in 1855. I saw them using those careful techniques, washing gold from gravel that white miners had dismissed as worthless. I saw them finding gold. Real gold. Enough to make them wealthy. And then I saw what came next. A group of white miners arrived. 8 of them, armed with rifles and pistols. They weren't there to negotiate. The scene played out in horrible silence, the Chinese miners backing away, hands raised, trying to surrender. But there would be no surrender. The massacre lasted less than 5 minutes. 18 Chinese miners were shot, clubbed, or thrown into the hydraulic sluice where the water pressure crushed them against the rocks. Their bodies were left where they fell. Within days, the hydraulic mining operations had buried the evidence under tons of sediment and stone. One of those miners was Wong Wei. He was 23 years old. He'd been in California for 18 months. He had a wife and infant daughter back in Guangdong province. He'd promised to return wealthy. Instead, he died face down in the mud, and his family never knew what happened to him. The vision faded. The man in the water was gone. But the singing continued. I turned in a circle, and now I could see them. Not clearly, they were like heat shimmer, distortions in the air, but they were there. Dozens of them. All along the walls of the gully, standing where they'd died. All singing that same song. And I finally understood what it was. It was a funeral song. They were singing their own funeral rites, because no one else ever had. I climbed out of that gully as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the camera. But as I reached the top, I heard a different sound. Footsteps behind me. I spun around. A figure was climbing out of the gully. Same blue tunic. Same queue. But this one was solid, real. His face was clear, and his eyes were human. Dark and sad and infinitely tired. Wong Wei. He looked at me, and I knew what he wanted. What they all wanted. Recognition. Remembrance. Someone to know they had existed, that they had died here, that their deaths had mattered. "I'll tell your story," I said. My voice was hoarse. "I promise. Everyone will know what happened here." He nodded slowly. Then he held out his hand. In his palm was something small and dark, a piece of gold. Raw gold, still embedded in quartz. I reached out to take it, and the moment my fingers touched the gold, the world lurched. I wasn't in China camp anymore. I was in Guangdong province, in a small house with paper windows. A woman was holding a baby, staring out the window at a road where no one was coming. She was waiting for someone who would never return. Waiting for Wong Wei. She would wait for 3 years before accepting he was dead. She would die in poverty, never knowing what happened to her husband. The daughter would grow up never knowing her father's face. The vision released me, and I was back in China camp, on my knees in the dirt, clutching that piece of gold in my hand. Wong Wei was gone. The singing had stopped. But carved into the tree trunk above the graves, in fresh marks that definitely hadn't been there before, were Chinese characters. I took a photo and later had them translated. They said, "Remember us." I spent the rest of that day documenting everything. The graves, the gully, the remains of the camp. I researched everything I could find about the 1855 massacre, and yes, there was a massacre, though it's barely mentioned in historical records. A footnote. A statistic. Chinese miners killed in claim dispute. 18 men murdered. Their bodies never recovered. Their families never notified. Their graves never marked. That piece of gold Wong Wei gave me, I had it analyzed. It's real, California gold, consistent with deposits from the Columbia area. But it shouldn't exist. The hydraulic mining removed every trace of gold from that gully 140 years ago. I went back to China camp yesterday. The incense in the bowl had burned down to ash, but there was a new bowl beside it. Someone, something, had placed another offering. And the graves that had been dug up? It was filled in again, the earth smooth and undisturbed. I left my own offering. 3 oranges, which I learned is traditional in Chinese culture. And I burned joss sticks while reading the names I'd researched, every Chinese miner who died in the Columbia area between 1850 and 1870. It took me 3 hours to read them all. When I finished, the wind picked up. Just for a moment, I heard that song again. But this time it wasn't sad. This time it sounded like gratitude. The California gold rush killed thousands of Chinese miners. They were driven from their claims, murdered for their gold, or worked to death in conditions no one else would accept. When they died, they were buried in unmarked graves or dumped in rivers. History forgot them. Records erased them. But they haven't forgotten. China camp is still there, south of Columbia's Main Street. The graves are still there, unmarked and unmaintained. And on certain nights, if you're very quiet, you can still hear them singing. Wong Wei showed me something important. Ghosts aren't just about fear. Sometimes they're about remembrance. Sometimes they just want someone to know they existed, that they mattered, that their deaths weren't meaningless. I made a promise to Wong Wei. I'm keeping it now. His story is told. His name is remembered. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough for him to finally rest. But I don't think he's alone yet. There are hundreds of others still waiting in those hills, still singing their funeral songs to an empty sky. Their stories need to be told too. Next time, I'm going deeper into Columbia's past. Into the tunnels where men died in darkness and never found their way out. The mines are calling, and I think I know what they want to show me. Subscribe if you want to follow this journey. The dead of the gold rush have more stories to tell, and I'm only beginning to hear them. Remember Wong Wei. Remember them all.